Welcome everybody to the Schools Funding webinar, which is about special educational needs funding arrangements. So all it leaves me to do now really is to welcome our presenter today. So Karina Kulovac has a wealth of experience. She's worked in special education and in local authorities and schools for over 25 years. She used to be the former head of SEN in Wiltshire. She's also a consultant, and she provides expert advice and support to local authorities, schools, trusts, colleges in relation to all aspects of work relating to SEN and disability. And she's also provided her expertise in a number of national research projects on the future of SEN funding. So we're in very capable hands, and she has a huge amount of knowledge to bring. So I hope you enjoy the session today, and I'm going to hand over to you now, Karina.
Thank you very much, Sue. This is really kind of you, and I hope I can live up to the expectations of that wonderful introduction. So welcome everybody. I just first, before I start, I would like to just say a few words about the fact that I'm really pleased that so many of you are interested in this topic and signed up to the session so quickly. But I also am very much aware that that level of interest might be the sign of either you knowing already quite a lot about the topic, or maybe some of you not knowing so much. So we probably have quite a mixed audience. It's very difficult to prepare a presentation for a mixed audience, so I apologize in advance if some of the information you'll find repetitive of something that you're already very much aware of, but some of you may find that some of that information goes into perhaps too much detail, but I will try to make it perhaps as interactive as we can during the question and answer session, so I'll be able to address some of that then. So what is the session going to involve? So first of all, just really brief summary of the national picture, because funding is something that applies to the whole country. So we do need to think about the national picture. And then, well, we then go back to, I suppose, something that you are very much aware of managing your own home budget, is where does the money come from and how is it spent? And it's not really much difference when you manage a budget for in the local authority or in school. So that's what you can expect from me today. That's what we are going to be talking about. So moving on, first of all, in terms of the national picture, many of you will remember this. This was a slide that goes back to 2014, when the Department of Education sort of, introduced us all to the new code of practice, and we all made a promise that that's what we are going to deliver. And of course, we are still on that journey. Today, we are not going to be talking about the code of practice so much. We obviously are going to be talking about money, but there is clearly a relationship about what we are trying to achieve and funding, although we must remember that funding is not the only component of success and of achieving the outcome. We do know that there are other very important issues which I know parents and carers highlight very often. So skills, attitudes, culture, two schools, two local authorities receiving the same amount of money may not be achieving the same outcomes for children and young people. So we have to keep in our heads that promise that was made, but we also have to think about the money coming in to achieve that promise may be used by different local authorities and different schools in different ways. Okay, so the vision for the from the code of practice, which is on the next slide, it's something that you probably know very well as well, but the one that I know parents and carers are very much aware of and wanting to make sure that it is in place is that middle one, parents knowing what they can reasonably expect from the local schools, colleges, and from the local authorities, local area, from services and providers. this is a key element to the transparent way that we all work together. So next slide, please. So the two legal frameworks, one is around the money side of things, and the other one is the code of practice. Now, the code of practice, probably you know very, very well, and the code of practice is talking in many places about best possible provision, but in some places it's talking about appropriate support. It's also talking about efficient use of resources. All of these words are very tricky to interpret and very tricky to pull together as what is best possible, what is appropriate, and what efficient use of resources means. Probably means very different things to different people. So these words are important, but debates about these words will be ongoing for some time to come. We are mainly here today talking about the funding element of it. So we've got also national funding legal framework that governs the way that money is devolved to schools, and it's delegated to local authorities to support children with special educational needs. I just wanted to draw your attention to the dates. So the money legal framework and the changes that were introduced in 2013 came before the legal framework around the special educational needs and the code of practice and the new Children and Families Act. So it's quite interesting to see that actually the changes in terms of how the money works came before the requirements of the code of practice. Next slide, please. Now, so you can see from those dates, 2013, 2014, 15, we've had the legal frameworks for some time now. Been quite a few years of us trying to implement them across the country. So you may already be aware that since 2019, there's been an ongoing SEN review that's been sort of put on hold a little bit last year, but is, I understand, back on track. And those are the key areas of focus of this SEN review. We understand that nothing is off the table, so that the scope of this SEN review is quite wide. I highlighted some key words driving this review forward. So clearly we are all about the quality, because the money, the resources we have, aim of everybody working in special educational needs is to make sure that the quality provision is consistently delivered across the country. But there are also some really difficult subjects that the SEN review is looking at, and specifically it's about inclusive mainstream support and also the specialist offer of placements in resource bases, units and special schools. And we're also talking about behavioural sort of issues related to incentives and accountability to ensure that children of special educational needs are included in schools, in wider society, and what that inclusion means. And the last one, which is very timely for us today, this review is also going to look at ensuring that the public money is spent in a very efficient, effective, but also sustainable manner, which it will not come as a surprise to any of you that it is of concern at the moment. So the next slide is going to list some of those contributing factors to those pressures and worries about how sustainable the system actually is. It's also drawing attention to some of the conflicting priorities that we may have in the system. So those are by no means, I'm not suggesting that that's a full list of those contributing factors, but certainly they highlight some of them. So we've already talked about new SEN legislation that came a few years back. It introduced new expectations around co-production, around person-centered planning, around outcome-based planning, but it also introduced the extension of the age range from 0 to 25. So there is a challenge around the fact that if that extension of the age range was appropriately supported by the availability of the right funding. The next contributing factor is demographic changes. Well, that's a big one for your local areas that you represent. We don't have huge increases in population, but there are significant regional differences. So some of your local areas might be experiencing quite significant increases, even though the area next door may not. We also have demographic changes that are related to advances in medical science and diagnosis. And the last one that is becoming really, really significant is rising levels of poverty. And we do know that disadvantage has got a direct link to special educational needs. So there are significant demographic changes that are happening as we speak and have been happening over the years. There are also changes in national policy. So the SEN Code of Practice and the legislation is now 5-6 years old. But since then, we've had changes in other aspects of the educational landscape. So we had changes in the curriculum, we had big changes in secondary school education, we had changes in a way of sort of interpreting what inclusion means. I've already mentioned the incentives and accountability. We had different Ofsted frameworks. We also had changes in the national legislation when it comes to, or regulations, when it comes to funding, which I'm going to talk about a bit later. And last, we come to the financial pressures. Now, the pressures come from the income, and I'm sure that everybody will argue that there is not enough money in the system, not just the educational system. We must remember that the code talks about the whole system, talks about a child in a holistic way, so therefore we are talking also about health and social care. So there are pressures in all three agencies in terms of funding. We're also talking about rising costs of actually delivering some of the provision. And we are also talking about the rising numbers of children with special educational needs across the country. So this is just a sort of a small selection of contributing factors that are sitting somewhere in the background. And what I really wanted to say is that although we've had that big change in legislation in 2014-15, life goes on and things change. And although that piece of legislation is still there, since then we've had many, many other things happening, not to mention the most recent crisis around the pandemic. So there are all of those contributing factors that are making your local area planning for how the money for special educational needs are used quite complex. So this is just a very, very brief overview of the national background, what's happening now, what's been happening since 2014, about the SEN review and the contributing factors to the sort of overview of the funding methodology. So we just had a very, very brief introduction of the national picture. I will be coming back to some of those national issues from time to time, but we will now focus on where does the money come from and how does the money flow from the central government to the local area and to local schools and colleges. So the next slide, please. So we've already mentioned that we are talking about three aspects of any child's life. So education, social care and health. Today, we are focusing specifically on education. However, I just wanted to very, very briefly to mention to everybody the sources of funding for all of three agencies, which will explain probably to you why sometimes those three agencies, probably you might have noticed a bit of a tension between when it comes to money, because the money comes from very different sources. So in education, we receive money from the central government, and it's called Dedicated Schools Grant, and that's the source of money that we'll be talking about today in much more detail. So I'll explain to you how the money comes into the local area, and the money comes in divided into those 4 blocks that are funding the whole way that the education works. Social care funding is funding that comes from the local government, so it comes from the local authority. It's important to sort of understand the difference, because when you understand the difference, you will know what the funding stream is competing against. So if you think about your local tax, your local authority tax that you pay, that tax is funding police, is funding social care, is funding potholes. It's funding lots of things in the local area, and social care comes into that pot. So that is where the money comes from to fund the social care element of provision for children. It's also up against adult care social funding, because that's also funded through the local authority budget. And then the third agency, health, is obviously funded separately again, and the money will come through the local CCGs, will come through the public health and the NHS England. So you can see just through this list how immediately, potentially, when it comes to money, there could be a sort of a potential conflict, and how these debates, local discussions about how we pull the money together to make sure that the children's needs are met is really, really important. So all of the work that you are involved in your local areas around joint commissioning is probably around how is this money spent, where does it come from, how is it then spent so that we get the right outcomes for children. So as I said, today we are just talking about education. So the next slide is going to just explain a little bit about how the educational funding comes in from the central government. So in education, the national government, as I've already said, the Dedicated Schools Grant is the pot of money that comes to the local area in a format of 4 blocks, if you like, that fund the educational provision in your local authority. Now, I did put a little note in terms of the further education and traineeships and apprenticeships, etc. That we will focus primarily today on schools funding. When it comes to early years and when it comes to colleges, the funding works slightly differently, but I didn't want to overcomplicate things. So I'm going to focus mainly on schools, but there is more information at the end of the presentation. So if some of you have particular issues or questions around further education colleges or early years, you'll be able to get that information at the very end. Okay, so the money comes in, and how is it calculated? Well, the government some years ago decided that they will introduce what's called a national funding formula. So a lot of head teachers in schools and people like myself and local authorities have said for many, many years that what we really want is a fair and transparent funding model. So what we really want is that a school in one area that has got similar children to of similar type of need to a school in another area is funded in a very similar way, because it felt very much as a sort of a postcode lottery. So what the government has done has listened to those comments and has introduced an idea around the national funding formula. So the next slide will give you a bit more detail about how this national funding formula came about. So the aim of this formula is to make sure that there is fairer and more equitable and more transparent way of funding. Now, as you know, what is fair to one may not be fair to somebody else. So it is a very emotive subject, and what the Department for Education is doing is trying to focus on formula factors that are based on needs. So formula is a mathematical formula where you put information in, and what you get out of it is a sum of money that is allocated to each local area, and then that gives you a feeling that at least it is as fair as possible in the whole system. We are still in the process of implementing that formula. It's still not completely implemented. There've been some delays, but if you hear in your local area or when you go to school forums, at least you will know what the national formula is. I don't know how many of you know what school forums are. So the national formula is, as it says, is a national way of funding, but local authorities still have a duty to have local school forums, which is basically a forum of head teachers, principals, and local parent partnerships, trade unions, who come together and make decisions about local arrangements. I don't know how many of you sit on school forums, but school forums would have mentioned something about a national funding formula. So I thought it would be really helpful to explain what that is. The next slide will show what type of information goes into the high needs funding formula, the national high needs funding formula. So you can see examples of things that will go into that mathematical formula before the total figure comes out. So what goes into that formula are things such as the number of pupils that there are in the local area, local attainment levels at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4, deprivation factors that are calculated for each local area, but also the number of children in bad health or with disability living allowance. So there is a number of factors that are coming in together. That mathematical formula then calculates what is the fair amount for each area. Okay, so if you hear from your local authority, we don't have enough money compared to a local authority next to us, it's probably because the factors that go into the formula did not indicate that they should have a higher level of funding. So the level of funding is dependent on those factors that go into the formula. So I hope that that makes sense. So once the local authority gets the amount of money, then they're able to decide how the money is spent. So the first thing to remember is that the drive through a national funding formula is to ensure that the local areas and local schools get fair amount of money that depends on the needs of the children living in that area. So the next slide will then explain to us how then this money translates into the local funding streams in each school. And again, this is a national system. So I'm sure you would have heard about element 1, element 2, and element 3 funding. And this is not your local authority system. This is a system that exists across the whole of the country. It's a cumulative system. So, I'll explain why. So we'll start from element 1. Element 1 is an amount of money that every child attending a school, doesn't matter which school, in which area, receives. And that element 1 is there to deliver effective, inclusive teaching in schools across the country. It is an amount that is different in clearly in different areas, but also is different in terms of ages. So very often younger children will receive less money compared to the older children. So children in infant schools will probably have less funding than children in junior schools, etc., etc. So children in Key Stage 4 will have more per child than children in primary schools. It's obviously linked to the cost of delivering the curriculum in different types of schools. But what we should remember is that that element 1 is for every single child, is individually allocated for that child, and depends on the number of children attending that particular school. The next element, element 2 funding, it also given to school, and it's given to schools for children who have been identified as having additional special educational needs. This element 2 is given to school as a lump sum of money. So let's say element 1 is on average £4,000 for every child in a school. Element 2 comes to a school in a form of a lump sum. So one school may get £200,000, another school may get £300,000, one school may get £40,000. It all depends, again, on that formula, which is driven by the needs of the children in that particular school. And that lump sum should be used by the school to meet the needs of children identified as having additional special educational needs. And together with element 1, will deliver that quality first teaching, will also deliver targeted interventions, additional interventions. So there may be small group or some individual interventions. It will deliver some resources, for example, equipment. And it might also deliver other reasonable adjustments that every schools will be required to support children with additional needs through the Equalities Act. Those two elements come to schools across the country without any involvement of the local authority as such. So that money is given to the schools, and it is then the responsibility of the school's senior leadership team and the governors of that school to ensure that the money is used effectively in order for children to make educational progress. In terms of the accountability of the element 1 and the element 2, it is the structure of the senior leadership team, but also the governors of the school that have the overall accountability of the school making the right decisions about how the money is spent so that children make progress. Ultimately, Ofsted is the body that comes and checks from time to time if the local schools make the right decisions, so that and checks on the outcomes for children in that particular school. Now, some children may have very, very complex special educational needs, and therefore the individual schools will then apply for top-up funding, which is the element 3. As the name of that source of funding indicates, is the top-up funding. So it is on top of what is already available within the school. That's why I mentioned there is a cumulative funding structure. So it's element 1 for all children, element 2 comes in for the children that need some additional support, and then element 3 on top of that if that is necessary. And again, I would like to stress that it's a national system. It works like this across the whole of the country. Now, that seems quite simple, but as we know, the devil is always in the detail, and we also know that individual local authorities implement this model in different ways. So I will talk about the detail of that a bit later. sometimes parents and carers ask questions about academies, free schools, maintained schools, non-maintained schools, and they ask, well, we have so many different types of schools. Does it work the same across the different types of schools? So the next slide will just illustrate some of that level of complexity that exists in the country. Now, I'm not showing this to you to illustrate that complexity and bother you with that complexity, because actually what you should remember that it doesn't matter if it's an academy or a free school or maintained school. That system that I've just explained about the element 1, element 2 and element 3 funding works the same across the whole of the country, across different types of settings, and it doesn't matter if they're academies or free schools or maintained schools by the local authority. It works the same across all types of schools. However, what is different is that the money comes to school in a different way. So that's all there is. That the money, when the school is an academy, it basically the money arrives in the school through a different channel, but it's still the same money. So some of the money arrives in the school through the Education and Skills Funding Agency, and some of the money arrives in the school through the individual council. So I just would like you to remember that, because I know that parents get very anxious from time to time, especially when it comes to academies and free schools, and they feel that just because the school is an academy or free school, that the funding arrangements are different. They're not. The only thing that is different is that the way the money travels. So just to illustrate that a little bit. So if you if you think about element 1, as you can see, the element 1 comes through the Education, Skills and Funding Agency. Element 2, however, you can see the difference straight away. Although it comes through the Education, Skills and Funding Agency, some of it comes from the high needs block, which is actually highlighted in red here. And although it comes out from the high needs block, it's still delivered through the Education and Skills and Funding Agency. So it is quite complicated, but unless people have specific questions about that, I wouldn't want to, I don't think there is a need to go into the detail of how the money flows. So I hope that that just reassures you that the model of funding is the same, the national framework for the legal framework, how the money works is the same across the country, but how the money is distributed to schools is quite different depending if it's an academy or free school or FE. So the next slide just confirms what I've just said. So just to remember that we are all working to one national legal framework, and the local school forums that I've just talked about have got some ability to make some level of decisions around how the money is spent, and I will talk about it in a moment when we talk about the spending of the money. So this session was all about the income. So how does the money come? Where does it come from? And how it's spent, we will talk about in the moment. So, so we get to the third part of the presentation, that it's about how the money is spent. So a moment ago, we talked about how the money comes in. If we move into the next slide, it just explains the responsibilities of all of the educational providers. So it doesn't matter what the educational provider is, they will all have funding in their budgets to address the additional needs of children with special educational need. Again, a reminder, this is a national funding system that works across the country, and we will talk about today a little bit about the magical £6,000 that I'm sure you all heard about. Again, this is a national, not a local threshold. And a moment ago, we talked about the income, and I focused on income that is related to special educational needs. But please be aware that there are other ways and other sort of income streams, such as pupil premium, and that is applicable for children looked after, for example, of children of free school meals. So none of what we are talking about today illustrates 100% of the funding system for education. It focuses on children with special educational needs. Okay, so the next slide, we'll probably spend a bit of time on the next slide because it's a really helpful visual that I hope will be able I'll be able to explain to you how this works. So I'm trying to keep to the color scheme. So the green representing the money that is already in the school that is not allocated for individual children with special educational needs, and the sort of yellowy orangey color is about children where we are allocating funding from the high needs block. Now, the green part of the triangle is absolutely key in terms of looking at the whole system approach. So the green part of the triangle illustrates what should be ordinarily available in any educational setting. You may remember at the beginning of the presentation, I did talk about the code of practice highlighting the fact that educational settings and local areas have a duty to ensure that the local offer and the school reports on the website are absolutely clear what parents and carers can ordinarily expect the educational settings to provide for children with additional needs. So first of all, at the universal level, this is the element 1 level, what we are expecting is that good quality teaching, inclusive teaching that we talked about a moment ago. And at the SEN support level, where some children are identified as having additional needs, that's where the element 2 funding comes into. Now, nationally on average, schools identify about 12% of children as having special educational needs. That decision is really, really key. Is a decision that each school takes individually within the school systems. That decision is probably driven by the school SENCO, and there will be systems in the school how the special educational needs are identified. Information about that should be available through the school information report, which is on their website, which would illustrate to you as parents and carers of how the decision about children's special educational needs are made. That decision should be made with the individual parent and carer and the child and young person. This decision is key. The correct identification of need is absolutely crucial. We see across the country over-identification or under-identification of special educational needs. So it is important that the figure of 12% is just an indicator, is an average. However, if the school is widely outside of the average, we would want the school to be absolutely clear why that is the case. So some schools will quote things like, oh, we have 40% of our children on special educational needs. Well, we really want to get to the bottom of it. Is that really correct? Is that true? Is it the needs of the children, or is it the needs, maybe training needs and support needs that teaching staff may require to put better provision, good quality teaching in the first place? So it is absolutely key to ensure that the identification of special educational needs is appropriate, relevant, and correct, because unless we can identify the need correctly, we will not be able to address the need with the strategies that we'll be putting in place. Now, for some children, schools or maybe parents will decide at some point that actually, despite all of the identification and assess, plan, do, review, they still feel that progress is not being made, and therefore they will ask the local authority for education, health and care needs assessment that may bring additional funding. Now, legally speaking, there is no requirement to link education, health and care needs assessment with the allocation of top-ups. So in some local authorities, you may have children with plans but without top-ups, or with top-ups but without plans. The vast majority of local authorities link the two together. So in vast majority of local authorities, the education, healthcare needs assessment is very likely to bring additional top-up, but that's not the case across the country and is not a requirement, a legal requirement to link the two together. So it is important to remember that whichever local authority you are representing, if you don't know already, it might be helpful to double check that. In terms of that last bit of the triangle, it's on average 3.3% of children that have education and healthcare plans. So very similar number will have top-up funding. So you can see that from all of the children in the educational system, 12% of children, around 12%, will be supported through that element 1 and 2. So the money that is delegated to schools to address the needs of the children. And a small percentage, just over 3% of children on average, will have very, very complex needs where, despite that graduated approach happening in schools, they're not making progress, and therefore additional top-up funding may be required. And that additional top-up funding is allocated for individual children. So just a reminder, in element 1, individual child, element 2 comes into school as a lump sum of money, but it is then up to the school to allocate from that lump sum of money support for individual children. Now, the threshold for the top-up funding, which comes from the high needs block, is £10,000. You probably have heard about the £10,000 many times. It was a threshold established back in 2013. And the definition of that threshold is that if the provision of a child costs more than £10,000, they become a high need pupil and they will require top-up funding. The £10,000 is accumulation of the element 1, which is on average £4,000 for every child, and up to £6,000 for SEN support. The reason why I say up to is because all children, that 12% of children, will have different level of needs. Some of them will only require additional support that may cost, I don't know, £500. Some of them may require support that costs £2,000. But some of them may require support that costs £6,000. So when we get to that level of support and the children still do not make progress, that's when individual schools will be requesting top-up funding, which comes on top of the £10,000 that the school is already spending. So I hope that brings together the information of what happens in individual schools when it comes to what should be ordinarily available, how that's funding, and what then is additional funding that comes that is allocated by individual local authorities. Okay, so the next slide, please. So we go back to the slide about how the money comes in, and the money that comes in to fund what is ordinarily available comes directly to schools. However, the high needs block element of the funding comes to the local authority. And this is the part of the funding that specifically funds support for children with additional special educational needs. So the next slide will show you what that element of the funding, sorry, the previous one, we've jumped one, I think. Oh, that's right, thank you. This will explain what this high needs block pays for. So we have three big elements that high needs block funds. So the first thing that you now know about is the element 3 top up. So the money that pays for those top-ups in mainstream schools, in special schools, in resource bases, in post-16 provision, in early years settings, will come from that high needs block. That's the pot of money that funds the element 2 top-ups. However, the high needs block also pays for places. So any places in specialist provision also are funded from that school's high needs block. The third element that is funded from this pot of money is services. So, for example, any specialist teachers that might be in your local area that are supporting children with visual impairment, hearing impairment, or autism, they are funded by the high needs block. So the high needs block is one of those sort of blocks of money coming into the local authority, and schools forums will be the place that there will be a debate about how much of this block will go on to funding services, element 3, or places. It all comes from the same pot of money. So remember that money was calculated nationally using the needs of the children living in the local area. It comes to the local authority, and the local authority with the schools forum then makes a local decision about which part of this block pays for services, top-ups, or places. And they have to balance that, because obviously if they pay a lot for element 3, they may not have enough money for services. If they pay a lot for places, they may not have enough money for element 3. So there is a bit of a trade-off between all of those sort of priorities that they will have to juggle. Again, I would like to bring your attention to the fact that independent school placements are also funded from this pot of money. So you will hear us parent carer forums, often conversations about pressure on places. Any children funded in the independent sector come from the same pot of money. There's often a lot of misconception that funding for those independent placements comes from somewhere else. It comes from the same pot of money. So if a local area spends a lot of money on independent school placements, they may not have enough money to fund local places in special schools. So I hope that that makes sense. So the next slide just illustrates how difficult those decisions are. So I will just go through one by one. So schools forums and local authorities and parent carer forums, hopefully that you are around the table in those conversations, making strategic conversations about how the money is spent. So if we think about services, those are the type of questions that they will be asking. Do we have the right services? Do we have enough of them? Who commissions them and who pays for them? Remember, services are funded, may be funded by the high needs block, but they may also have a bit of a contribution from health services. For example, speech and language services often are jointly funded, and that's where the joint commissioning comes in, by health and education. So those are the type of debates where we have to think about what is the need of children in the local area, and do we have the right services? Are we spending the money on services efficiently? Are we commissioning the right services to do the right job? Next one. will be about places. So same question, do we have enough places? Now, in every local area I've been to, people say, no, we don't, we need more. Remember about that first slide, if you spend too much money on places, you may not have enough money to support services or element 3. So it is important to remember those two. But also important to remember that is not just the overall number of places. We also have to think about, do we have the places for the right age group? Do we have the right places for the right SEN type? So just to give you an example, children with severe learning difficulties or profound and multiple learning difficulties, on average in the country, we haven't got a huge growth in numbers in SLD and PMLD, but we do have growth in numbers of children with autism or SEMH. So if the local area is growing number of places for severe learning difficulties and PMLD, we need to ask ourselves, why is that? Another one is age. Many parents and carers of children, even with complex needs, choose mainstream schools for children in primary schools, but choose specialist provision in secondary. So it's no good to have the same number of places in primary and secondary if we know that the demand is high in secondary. So those conversations are very nuanced and they need to be considered very, very carefully because the picture is very, very complex. So that's places. So we talked about services, we talked about places. Now the third one is top-ups. So this is the next slide will show us the top-up funding, and I'm using a table that is probably slightly out of date because it's 2014, but actually illustrates an issue that is still very much around. And this is about a piece of research that I was part of at that time. It was a national research where we worked with 15 local authorities across the country. And what I did, I wrote profiles of 5 children. So you can see Johnny, Kate, Peter, Grace, and Indy, different age groups, different need types. And what I did, I gave that profile of the child to a wide number of local authorities and a wide number of schools and colleges. And I asked them, simple question, if Johnny, Kate, Peter, Grace, and Indy lives in your local area or comes to your school, would you need a top-up? Yes or no? And if yes, how much would you like? Or how much do you think would be needed to meet the needs of Johnny, Kate, Peter, Grace, and Indy? And what I've highlighted in red is the answers we got. I don't think it takes rocket science to just immediately notice how different the answers are. We don't really have a sort of like a module to say that a child with this type of need will cost that much money, because we all have different views of how the child's needs may be met. So you can see with Johnny, some schools didn't want, and some local authorities didn't feel that they would need any top-up whatsoever, that they could actually meet his needs within the resources that are ordinarily available. But others thought that they needed quite a lot of money, and some said that they needed £19,000 top-up alone, and that's on top of the 10,000. So you can see how tricky the conversations about top-ups are, and how important it is to make sure that each local area develops its own way of identifying the need and making sure that the decisions about top-ups are made in a fair and transparent way. So that I was just sort of trying to illustrate how difficult it is to get it right. And it doesn't matter how many times we think we got it right, there will always be somebody who will think that actually we didn't. So going back to the national way of funding, the next slide will just summarize everything that I've said a moment ago It's not to scale, by the way. So there is not a right balance between the green and the yellow, but it just illustrates how the funding works again. So on the left, I've listed all of the different types of provision that children and young people may have, and then we'll just go through that and compare all of those funding streams. Everything that is in yellow comes from the high needs block. Everything that is in green is money that is already delegated to schools. So mainstream schools, as you can see, they get this element 1 and element 2. So element 1 on average £4,000 plus element 2 up to £6,000 per child. Up to £6,000 per child, but remember it comes as a lump sum, and then a top-up funding that comes from the local authority from the high needs block. Then some children will go to units or resource bases that are co-located with mainstream schools. So it's very similar. That child will also attract element 1 funding, so the average £4,000. That child will then get actually a place value. So they will actually get not lump sum anymore, they will actually get the £6,000 and they will get a top up. Special schools, every single place in a special school is worth £10,000 plus a top up. So you can see that £10,000 is a common theme for all different types of schools. The only difference is again how the money comes in. So the number of places commissioned in special schools by the local authority, the local authority will spend £10,000 on every single place they commission. So at the beginning of the year, they will go to school and they will say, we want to commission you for 100 places. It doesn't matter if they're taken or not taken, the local authority has to give the special school the £10,000 per place. The top up only comes when the actual child arrives. Then we've got independent schools. Independent schools do not have this model of funding. Independent schools just have school fees. So if a child is placed in an independent school, the money comes as a fee and is paid for as a fee, and the money comes from the high needs block. And support services, as I said a moment ago, also the money comes from the high needs block, depending on what service is commissioned. So this just illustrates to you how the money flows in different types of school and how the £10,000 high need threshold works across mainstream schools, across units, and across special schools. Okay, next slide, please. So the top-up funding, as I mentioned a moment ago, is something that we allocate per child by the local authority, and local authorities, because of their aim to ensure that they want to make it as fair, as transparent as possible, they develop different tools to make sure that they can achieve that. So one of those tools is the banding models or matrix or anything else that local areas may use. So I'm sure as parents you've heard about the banding models. So banding is simply a tool that local authority will use to make sure that the top-up funding is allocated fairly, because as you saw a moment ago, when it comes to individual providers, individual schools, they vary enormously in their views of how much it costs to meet the child's needs. So this is just an illustration how the banding models work. So the element 1 and element 2, we already know how it works. It's in schools. So now we have a request for a child for top-up funding for element 3. Now in any local authorities, in any local authority, there may be hundreds of children that have top-up funding. So therefore, how do you determine what is fair and what is right, what amount is right? So the local authorities develop banding with descriptors to make sure that they, by using those banding models, they then allocate the money as fairly as possible. Those banding models will apply to mainstream, to resource bases, and to special schools. Some local authorities may have 5 bands, some local authorities may have 10 bands. I worked in a local authority once that had 50 bands. I mean, there is no one model working across the whole of the country. These models are very much developed locally with local schools, with head teachers, with SENCOs, with special schools, with resource bases. And Sue already mentioned one of the local authorities that we are going to mention today, where Parent Carer Forum was very heavily involved in designing such a model and then communicating this model to parents and carers. So banding model is nothing more than just a tool that the officer of the local authority will use to ensure that the right amount is allocated to the right child. So they will look at the needs of the child, and then they will look at the descriptors in the bands, and they will allocate the funding that comes with it. And the banding values, so for example, a child may be band 2, so they will be allocated a band 2, and the school's forum will allocate the value to that band 2. So they may say, band 2, we can afford to pay, I don't know, £3,000. So that child will then get £3,000. Remember that slide where that one pot of money is paying for services, elements 3 and places. So the value of the band will be determined on what funding is available in that local authority. If that particular local authority has completely overspent on the independent sector, or has commissioned too many places, or has commissioned too many services, they may not have enough money left to pay for element 3, and element 3 might be lower than normally expected. So it's all very much interconnected. So that's how it sort of strategically works. So the band 2 may remain for that child for years to come, but the value of that band 2 may be changing depending on what funding is available to within the high needs block. Okay, so that's how the mystical banding works, and that's how the banding is used. And as I say, the purpose of that is the fair and transparent allocation of funding. As you can see, the allocation of funding is a very emotive subject. It's a very difficult subject, and as I say, it's a very difficult subject strategically to make sure that we manage all of those pressures, but also on child by child basis. So the next slide is just a summary of some research that was done some years ago, not that long ago actually, I think it was 2018, where this research indicated, again, working across the country, visiting different local areas and thinking, okay, what actually works? When does it work? Because in some local authorities, it works better than in others. So, you know, what makes it good practice? What makes it work? And those are the sort of things that they've come up with. Now, you can see it's not rocket science. It really isn't, but I've highlighted the key ones for me. And the first one is shared understanding. And I would underline the word shared, because it's not enough just the head teachers to understand how funding works. It has to be all partners understanding. So health, education and care, local authority, parents and carers, shared partnership understanding of the funding issues in your local area. Second one is building the confidence of parents in that local area. If parents don't have the trust and the confidence, they will question and they will ask and they will not be satisfied that their children's needs are met and that the outcomes are being achieved. So the partnership working is absolutely key. So the good example of the partnership working that Sue just referred to a moment ago is a really good example how parent carers can get involved in developing those local solutions. So just coming to an end, I sort of put together a few tips for local parent carer forum in developing that strategic partnership. So the next slide just gives you the sort of top tips for that, and the building joint understanding is key. Now, it doesn't happen overnight. It really doesn't. It takes time. In fact, that example of good practice that we are sharing with you today from Hertfordshire indicates a 5-year process of developing the new way of working together. It doesn't happen overnight. And whatever you hear in the local area, always try to ask questions, benchmark and compare. As I say, whichever local area I work for, people develop sort of perceptions of the local area, but it is important to compare your local area to other similar local areas to see if things can be done differently. The relationships and trust goes without saying, because if any partner feels that something is hidden from them, it will never work. So it doesn't matter how difficult the messages are, they all have to be on the table, and you have to find a way through it together. So I put no elephants in the room and no skeletons in cupboards, because that is not a good start of any partnership working. These opportunities for joint working don't always come very often, but when they do come, please look out for them, because it is a really always the best way of working. And the last thing is, I can assure you, for the last 7 years, I've worked as an SEN consultant across the whole of the country. I've worked in London, I've worked extensively in the Southwest, in the Midlands. There is no perfect solution to this out there. If there was, I can assure you, I would tell you that today, and I would tell all of these local authorities, and I would be made redundant overnight. But it really is not there. Although we have a legal framework, the local solutions have to be developed locally. So it is important to partnership locally. And the last slide, the next one, just highlights that case study that Sue referred to. I think she wrote it up actually, and I think it will be sent out in the pack together and presented on the website together with this presentation. But I would really encourage you to read this case study, because it's a very interesting piece of work where the local parent care forum engaged in a very tricky and difficult piece of work with the local authority and schools forum, but achieved great outcome in the end. So I think coming to the end of that third session about how the high needs funding is spent.
So yeah, Karina, that was really informative session. You know, I learned so much, and I feel like I'm clearer, and I'm sure the forums too feel that they understand it more. And I totally agree with what you're saying. There is stuff that forums can get involved in strategically, and you mentioned the Hertfordshire case study that we've got on the webinar. So do give us your feedback on how this session's been for you. It's a different way of doing it. We've tried to make it a little bit more interactive. And also, if you think there are other things that you think around funding that we should be covering in future interactive sessions or webinars, do let us know, because we always value your feedback. But for now, I'd just like to thank Karina for her time. I'd like to thank all the parents who got involved and co-produced this with us, particularly from the Swindon and the South Gloucestershire Forum and Hertfordshire, of course, as well, for all of their help. But, you know, thank you, Karina, for delivering such a clear presentation today. It's been fantastic. And thank you, everyone, for giving us your time and attending today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. And I hope it was helpful, and it will help you in your partnership working in your local area. Thank you.